He thought it was just another mark left after the storm. But when he stepped closer, the ground beneath his feet began to move, and when he pierced the strange bubble in his yard, he uncovered something that had been hidden for decades. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm that tore across the town in the late hours of the night had been unlike anything Marcus had experienced in years. Long after midnight, when the sensible quiet of the neighborhood should have settled in, the house shook with every violent gust of wind that barreled across the yard. Rain struck the windows with such force that the glass trembled in its frame, and the old wooden siding of the house moaned under the pressure. Marcus lay awake in bed, staring at the dim outline of the ceiling as flashes of lightning split the sky outside and illuminated the entire room for an instant before plunging it back into darkness. Each thunderclap rolled across the roof like an upheaval of the earth, a deep, resonant growl that reverberated through the walls and into his chest. By 3 a.m, he understood there would be no sleep. He sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of the world being reshaped outside. The great maple tree at the far end of his yard groaned and whipped its branches in the stormy wind, sounding at moments as though it might be torn apart. At times, he heard what he thought were sirens in the distance, swallowed and reshaped by the wind until it was impossible to tell if they were real. For a few minutes during the worst of it, all the lights in the house dimmed, flickered twice, and died. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the noise had been. Marcus found a flashlight, checked the windows, and stood at the front door listening to the storm hammer in the street. When the power returned, it did so with a reluctant hum, and the overhead lights brightened one bulb at a time. The storm continued its assault as hours passed. Wind slammed against the house in bursts, rain swept across the ground in diagonal sheets, and the gutters overflowed with such force that water poured over the edges like miniature waterfalls. The yard, which Marcus had worked so hard to maintain, despite the modest means he lived with, was being punished relentlessly. He knew he would have a long morning ahead. Trees to clear, drainage to check, debris to gather. Still, he preferred that predictable physical work over the uneasy sense of confinement he felt during the storm. Nature's fury he could handle. It was the waiting, the listening, the imagining that always pushed his nerves to the edge. When dawn finally came, it did so reluctantly. The sky was washed with a dull grayness, the kind that dims the world rather than brightens it. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The air felt thick, heavy with leftover humidity and the scent of soaked soil. When Marcus stepped outside, the door stuck slightly at the bottom from the swelling of the wood, another small reminder of the night's violence. He exhaled a cloud of mist into the chilly morning and walked down the steps, surveying the state of the front yard. Leaves were plastered to the porch in a thick carpet. Branches, some no thicker than his thumb and others as thick as a wrist, were scattered across the lawn. In a few places, the soil had formed small depressions where water had gathered and then drained, leaving behind sculpted bowls and rivulets etched into the mud. He took his time walking the perimeter of the house. The exterior seemed intact, though the siding would need a wash, and one gutter had come loose. He noted it mentally, knowing that repair would not be difficult, but the earlier tension still lingered within him. He moved toward the backyard, expecting to find more damage there. The rear of the property was less sheltered from the wind, and the poor drainage of the soil often turned the ground into a sponge after heavy rain. But as soon as he reached the corner of the house, something stopped him. Not something he saw, but something he heard. A sharp, insistent hiss cut through the quiet morning air. It was steady, not fading in and out like the whistling of wind through a broken pipe or the rustle of leaves. The sound was unnatural, controlled in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. Marcus stepped forward, narrowing his eyes, trying to locate the source. With each step he took toward the middle of the backyard, the sound grew louder, though not by much. It had an odd way of feeling close and far at the same time, as though it were both everywhere and nowhere. He stopped walking and held his breath to listen. The hiss continued at a constant pitch, vibrating against the silence of the morning. He turned his head slightly, following the direction of the sound, and soon realized it drew him toward the far side of the yard, near the old clothesline pole he had not used in years. The closer he came, the deeper the unease settled in his chest. The storm had been destructive, yes, but nothing about it explained this sound. As he rounded the last corner of the house, finally stepping into the open of the backyard, the noise grew clearer, sharper, more concentrated. He scanned the ground, expecting perhaps a broken sprinkler head or some kind of exposed pipe, even though he knew none existed there. Instead, he was met with a sight so strange that for several long seconds he could only stare, unsure if his tired mind was tricking him. The ground was swollen, not in a small way, not like the subtle rise of soft soil after frost, but dramatically, unmistakably lifted. An enormous mound bulged upward in the center of the yard, stretching nearly from one fence line to the other. The shape was smooth and rounded, as though the earth had been inflated like a balloon from underneath. The grass, soaked from the night's rain, clung tightly to its contours, making the entire mass appear taut, almost rubbery. The color was darker than the rest of the yard, a deep, saturated green with streaks of mud bleeding through where the turf had thinned. Marcus felt his heart pace quicken. He took cautious steps forward, circling the mound from a distance first, trying to understand its dimensions. It was much larger up close, a solid rise almost 20 feet in diameter at its widest, tapering toward the edges. The shape was too symmetrical, too deliberate to be some random force of nature. Yet he saw no footprints, no tire tracks, no sign that heavy equipment had ever been near his property. The hissing was coming from the mound. It was impossible to mistake now. Standing just a few feet away, he could hear it loud and clear. The sound was emanating from somewhere beneath the swollen dome of earth, a pressurized whisper forcing its way into the air through the dense, wet soil. It was not the kind of sound that suggested danger in an immediate sense, but rather the kind that spoke of something hidden, something unnatural, something under strain. Marcus crouched down, placing a hand on the ground near the edge of the mound. The soil felt soft and unstable, like a waterbed. When he pressed lightly with his palm, he felt the ground shift, a subtle but undeniable trembling movement under the surface. He pulled his hand away and stared, suddenly more alert. For a moment, he wondered if a pipe had burst somewhere beneath the yard, creating a pocket of water trapped under the turf. He had heard of such things happening in poorly drained areas, but this mound was far too large, the pressure beneath it too intense to be the result of a simple leak. And even then, why would a broken pipe cause the ground to rise so evenly, as though carefully inflated? The storm had battered many houses in the neighborhood, and he had expected fallen branches, cracked fences, maybe even roof damage. But this bizarre swelling of the earth, was something he never could have prepared for. He rose slowly from his crouched position, continuing to study the mound. Nothing about it looked stable. The surface glistened faintly where rainwater still clung to the blades of grass. The muted morning light made it appear almost alive, as though it were breathing shallowly beneath its own weight. Marcus felt himself growing increasingly unsettled, yet he knew he could not simply walk away. He needed to understand what had caused this. His property had never shown signs of underground issues, and this sudden dramatic change could not be ignored. As he took another step toward the mound, the ground beneath his boot shifted again, responding to his presence. He realized then that the earth not only felt inflated, it moved. A living sensation underfoot, the slightest ripple, like the slack tension of a balloon adjusting to the pressure of a touch. He stepped back out of instinct, heart thumping hard in his chest. He scanned the rest of the yard, half expecting other strange mounds or signs of instability. But the rest of the ground, though waterlogged from last night's storm, seemed unchanged. Only this one enormous swelling disrupted the familiar landscape. Marcus swallowed, feeling the uneasy weight of a new reality settling in. The storm had passed, leaving behind broken branches and overturned trash cans, but it had also awakened something beneath his feet. He felt a pull toward the mound, a need to understand the origin of that strange hiss and the mysterious swelling of the earth. The silence of the morning made the sound stand out even more sharply, like a warning or an invitation. Whatever had happened during the night had reshaped his yard in a way he did not yet understand. And as he stood in the cool, damp air, feeling the ground pulse faintly beneath him and hearing the persistent whisper of trapped air or water, Marcus knew that the storm had not simply left behind debris. It had uncovered a secret buried for decades, a secret whose first signs now rose beneath a trembling mound of earth, waiting for him to take the next step. For several long seconds after his first inspection of the swollen ground, Marcus stood motionless, as though rooted in the wet earth beneath him. The strange mound seemed even larger now that he had dared to touch it, even more unnatural after feeling it shift like something alive beneath his hand. The persistent hissing sound only added to his growing sense of unease. It reminded him of air leaking from a tire, constant, pressured, refusing to be ignored. Yet the mound was far too large to be explained by anything so simple. The storm had certainly brought chaos, but this felt like the aftermath of something deeper, something hidden, something waiting. Marcus straightened slowly, trying to steady his breath. The drizzle had stopped, though droplets still clung to his hair and jacket from the moisture-saturated air. The yard smelled of rain-soaked soil, torn grass, and the lingering metallic tang of a storm-swept night. But beneath those familiar scents, there was something else creeping in now. Something earthy and stale, as though something long sealed away had been nudged closer to the surface. He took another cautious step toward the mound, feeling again the subtle, wobbling shift beneath the turf. His weight made the swollen earth sink just barely underfoot, and he pulled back instinctively, heart thudding. The sensation was too bizarre, too soft and unstable to be anything but dangerous. Yet he also knew he couldn't leave it unattended. If the ground gave way, if water erupted unexpectedly, or if something beneath the surface was failing structurally, the consequences could be destructive. The yard might collapse entirely, or worse, the foundation of the house could be affected. His mind drifted briefly to memories of his late father, who used to tell him that when something on your land feels wrong, you don't wait for it to get worse. You deal with it before it decides to deal with you. The words echoed in Marcus's mind, pushing him toward action. He turned towards the small shed near the back corner of the property. The door creaked loudly as he opened it, hinges protesting after years of humidity and neglect. Inside, tools hung from hooks or lay scattered in dusty piles. He scanned them quickly, searching for something long enough to pierce deeply into the mound without bringing him too close to the unstable surface. His fingers closed around the shaft of an old garden tool, a long-handled digging bar with a narrow, pointed end. Heavy, solid, strong enough to punch through packed soil. It wasn't elegant, but it would do. Marcus hefted it, feeling the cold weight of the metal settle into his palms. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the shed and back toward the strange bulge rising from the yard. The hissing grew slightly louder as he approached, the steady whisper pushing at his nerves. He stopped a few feet from the mound, tightening his grip on the tool. He hesitated just for a breath, then raised the bar and drove it down with controlled force into the softened earth. The reaction was instantaneous. A deep, resonant pop cracked through the air, followed by a violent, churning sound beneath the turf. Marcus stumbled a step backward as the ground beneath the tool gave way. In the next heartbeat, water burst from the pierced mound with a startling force. A thick, muddy torrent surged upward through the opening, splashing across his boots and pouring outward in powerful waves. It was colder than he expected, carrying with it the scent of stale earth, damp roots, and something strangely metallic. Marcus instinctively jumped back, raising an arm to shield his face from the spray. The water did not emerge in a neat trickle. It exploded out, gushing in a relentless stream that widened the hole he had created. The soil around the puncture softened rapidly, collapsing under its own weight as the pressure beneath the surface forced its way into the open air. The mound deflated slowly but dramatically, like a massive lung exhaling after being held under strain. Dark water flooded the yard, running in rivulets toward the lowest points in the ground. It pooled around Marcus's boots, soaking through the old leather. The cold seeped in as he watched, stunned, wondering how much water had been trapped beneath the turf and what had caused such a severe buildup in the first place. The storm alone couldn't explain this kind of pressure. Something beneath the surface had collected water over time. Days, weeks, maybe even years, and the violent storm had simply provided the final push needed to inflate the ground to a breaking point. He took a step back, allowing the water to flow freely. It rushed across the lawn, carving shallow streams that snaked towards the fence and the narrow drainage path near the back gate. The ground, where once it had bulged high, now sagged inward, sinking slowly into itself as the hidden pocket emptied. Marcus knew his yard would be a muddy, unstable mess for days, but that was the least of his concerns now. The speed and power of the water made it clear that this had not been an ordinary pooling beneath the soil. Something artificial must have held the water there, something that allowed it to accumulate and expand. He continued to watch as the flow gradually weakened. What had first burst forth like a miniature geyser now trickled in a narrow stream. The mound had all but collapsed, leaving behind a wide, shallow depression. The air felt cooler now, heavy with mist and the earthy smell of freshly exposed soil. As the last of the water drained, Marcus noticed something protruding from the center of the muddy cavity. At first, he thought it was just a piece of root, or perhaps a rock dislodged by the powerful outflow. But as he took a few steps closer, he realized it was too smooth, too uniform, and too black to be something natural. It was a corner of some material, thin, flat, and artificial. Marcus squatted beside it, brushing away mud with his hand. The substance beneath his fingers was slick and firm. He pulled away another clump of soil, revealing more of the surface. It resembled plastic, but thicker and sturdier than any garden liner he had ever encountered. The texture was industrial, dense, and clearly designed to withstand heavy pressure. A strange chill crept up his spine. This wasn't a random piece of debris carried by the storm. It wasn't part of a broken pipe or some leftover construction scrap. This material had been deliberately placed here, beneath the soil of his yard, and not just in one small section. As he cleared away more mud, he saw that the plastic sheet extended beyond the boundaries of the collapsed mound, disappearing into the surrounding earth. Marcus stood slowly, staring at the exposed surface. The storm, violent as it had been, had not created this. It had revealed it. The mound had been nothing more than a symptom. The true cause was still hidden beneath the layers of soil and unnatural plastic. The water had been trapped, not by accident, but by design. Someone had put this barrier here, long before Marcus had moved into the house, and whatever they had buried beneath it had stayed sealed for years, maybe decades, until the storm loosened the earth enough to expose the truth. The yard continued to drain, leaving behind mud thick enough to pull at his boots when he tried to step away. The hissing was gone now. Only a faint gurgle remained from where the last of the water was escaping through the broken turf. The air was quiet, almost eerily so. Marcus found himself listening for any remnant of the strange sound, but the quiet was absolute. It was as though the earth had exhausted itself and fallen still. He crouched again, inspecting the strange material more carefully. The edges were frayed in places, worn by age, but the integrity of the sheet itself was surprisingly strong. He dug his fingers beneath the corner, trying to lift it, but it resisted stubbornly. It was anchored deep, likely extending across the width of the yard, maybe even farther. The idea unsettled him. The thought that something so large, so deliberately installed, had existed beneath his home without his knowledge made the yard seem suddenly foreign. Not part of his house, not part of his life, but rather a covering for something hidden, concealed, perhaps even forbidden. He let the plastic corner fall back into place, the material snapping flat against the wet earth. He rose to his feet again, breathing deeply as he tried to calm the rush of questions swirling in his mind. Who had done this? What purpose could it have served? Why bury something large enough to require this kind of barrier? The storm had passed, but Marcus sensed that the true disturbance had only just begun. He took one last look at the collapsed mound, now a wide basin of mud and slowly subsiding water. The plastic surface glinted faintly in the dim light of the clouded morning, beckoning him to uncover more. Whatever lay beneath had been hidden for a reason, and now, whether he wanted it or not, he found himself standing at the threshold of a mystery buried deep under his own backyard. The storm had torn branches from trees and scattered debris across the neighborhood, but it had also pulled loose the first thread of a secret woven into the land long before Marcus ever lived here. And as he stared down at the strange artificial barrier, slick with rain and mud, he felt the first faint pull of inevitability. The earth had spoken. Something beneath it wanted to be found, and he would not be able to look away. The yard was still draining slowly when Marcus finally forced himself to move again. The surge of water that had erupted from beneath the swollen ground had left the entire back section of his property submerged in a murky, churning mess. The once familiar lawn was now a soft, collapsing mixture of mud, shredded grass, and newly exposed earth that sank beneath every step he took. The air felt different, too, as though the storm had stirred up not just the soil, but something old and latent beneath it. The lingering dampness carried an undercurrent of decay, a heavy scent that seemed to emerge from a place untouched for decades. The strange black material he had exposed sat stubbornly in the middle of it all, dark and flat like the concealed lid of something enormous. Marcus stood over the plastic sheet again, staring down at the smooth surface that glistened faintly under the gray sky. It didn't belong here, not in the soil of a modest yard in a quiet town, not buried beneath layers of earth that had settled naturally over half a century. The thing looked as though it had been put there by deliberate human hands, methodically and with purpose. The idea unsettled him deeply. It was one thing to find a cracked pipe or an old foundation stone. It was something else entirely to uncover an intact industrial membrane hidden beneath the entire lawn like a secret floor. He crouched again, brushing away the edges where the plastic met the muddy soil. The texture was unmistakably intentional. It was thick, pliable, but incredibly strong, like the heavy liners used in construction or large storage facilities. Not something a homeowner would ever casually place under a yard. Certainly not something any gardener would ever use. It had been installed long before his time, long before the house belonged to him. The corner he had initially uncovered was not enough. Marcus knew he had to see more if he was going to understand what this was. He removed his soaked gloves and placed his fingers under the edge again, trying once more to lift the sheet. It resisted stubbornly, barely budging before settling back with a heavy slap. Whatever this thing covered, it was large. The sheet didn't seem to be a small patch. It appeared to extend well beyond the area the storm had revealed. That meant someone had laid it with precision, likely cutting it to fit exactly the borders of the buried structure. Marcus straightened slowly, glancing across the expanse of the yard. If the sheet stretched from this point towards the fence, it might well continue all the way to the opposite side. He needed to confirm it. Carefully, he walked around the collapsing depression and made his way towards the far edge of the backyard. The soil sucked at his boots as he moved, thick and heavy from the saturation. Every step carried the faint sound of water shifting beneath the surface, a sloshing reminder that the bubble beneath the turf had only partially emptied. He reached the fence line and knelt down, pushing aside the wet grass. The ground here looked undisturbed, but his instincts told him otherwise. He set his jaw and pressed his fingers into the earth. The soil was softer than usual, heavy with water, but it didn't offer any unnatural resistance. He took out his folding knife, its blade slick with rainwater, and punctured the turf just beneath the surface. The blade slipped through the muddy earth, and with a quiet tearing sound, it struck something beneath. There it was. The knife caught, dragging against the same kind of thick plastic material he had just uncovered near the mound. He widened the cut, revealing another clean, black surface. His pulse quickened. The sheet was indeed spread across the entire yard. This wasn't a tarp or a discarded liner. This was a deliberate covering, stretching from one end of the property to the other. And beneath it was something someone had gone to great lengths to hide. Marcus sat back on his heels, staring down at the second patch of exposed material. His thoughts raced. Who would cover an entire yard with something like this? What possible purpose could it serve? The house had been old when he bought it, but he had always believed that its history was uneventful, just another modest home in a quiet neighborhood with nothing more dramatic in its past than a few tax records and a change of ownership every couple of decades. Yet now he found himself kneeling above what felt like a secret sealed away by someone who had not wanted it disturbed. He stood again and walked the length of the yard, feeling almost as though he were tracing the edges of an invisible structure. The ground felt different beneath his boots now. Every soft patch, every uneven shift of mud reminded him of the unnatural layer hidden beneath. It was not simply lying on the soil. It was pressed tightly against something firm and deliberate below. A surface, maybe even a ceiling. Returning to the central area where the mound had collapsed, Marcus felt a strange determination settle over him. He needed to uncover more. He needed to see what was beneath the plastic, even if he didn't yet understand what he hoped or feared to find. The storm had revealed something important, and he couldn't turn away now. He crouched beside the main exposed section again. The water had mostly drained away, leaving the depression slick with mud but no longer actively filling. The plastic lay partially uncovered, its edges rising where water had swelled beneath it, creating slight air pockets that now lay deflated. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans, feeling the grit and moisture cling to the fabric. Then he pulled the folding knife from his pocket again. The blade glinted, reflecting the dull light. He made a small incision near the edge of the sheet, enlarging the cut he had created earlier. The knife sank into the plastic with effort, confirming how thick and durable it truly was. He dragged the blade several inches, widening the opening. When he lifted the flap, a cold rush of stale, enclosed air escaped from beneath. The smell hit him at once, old, dense, sour, like fruit left sealed in a cellar long past its time. It was a smell that spoke of wood soaked in humidity, of earth undisturbed for decades, of a place starved of fresh air. Marcus held his breath, pulling the flap of plastic farther back. Beneath it lay a layer of dark, compacted soil, followed by something even more unexpected: wood. The surface was rough and uneven, the boards laid side by side in what looked unmistakably like deliberate construction. They were old, far older than anything he'd seen in his yard before. The grain was swollen from moisture, the color darkened to nearly black, but the structure was undeniably man-made. Someone had built a floor beneath the ground, a concealed one. The strange odor grew stronger as more air escaped. Marcus covered his mouth with his sleeve, though the stench still seeped through. He shifted his position, wiping away clumps of mud from the wooden surface. As he cleared more of it, the pattern of the boards emerged. They formed a flat platform, wide and smooth in some places, cracked and warped in others. It looked like the top of a buried room, a ceiling. The realization sent a chill down his back. There was a hidden structure beneath his yard, something someone had intentionally sealed beneath layers of plastic and soil. The ceiling was made of wood, aged and compromised, but still intact enough to hold the weight above it. The thought of an entire room lying unknown, just feet beneath where he had walked for years, unsettled him deeply. It felt as though the earth itself had been living a second, secret life below the surface of his home. As he cleared more of the wooden platform, his fingers brushed over something metal. He paused, feeling an unexpected jolt of anticipation. The object was small and half buried in the mud, but when he dug around it gently, his hand closed over a circular shape. It was cold, heavy, and unmistakably crafted. He pulled it free from the sticky earth, revealing the full form, a large metal ring, tarnished and rusted, attached to a wooden plank. It was a handle. Marcus stared at it, heart pounding. Not a random piece of debris, not a rusted tool. A handle embedded into the wooden ceiling beneath his yard. It was attached to a wooden panel slightly larger than the others around it, suggesting a hatch or door. Something intended to open. He wiped more mud away, revealing the edges of the panel. The outline was clear, a square cut into the wooden ceiling, distinct from the surrounding boards. The handle was mounted firmly at the center, though rust had fused some of the metal to the wood. It was a door. A hidden door leading into whatever lay beneath the ground. Marcus sat back, overwhelmed for a moment by the magnitude of what he had uncovered. This was no minor structure, no misplaced cellar or forgotten storage cavity. This had been built with intention, concealed carefully, and sealed so thoroughly that decades of soil had accumulated above it, hiding it entirely from sight. He reached out and gripped the handle. It was stubborn, resisting his first attempt to lift it. The wood creaked but did not give. He tried again, bracing his boots in the mud for leverage. The hatch remained immovable. The years had welded it shut, yet now that he had found it, he knew he would not stop until he opened it. He looked around his yard once more. The storm had torn away trees, soaked the ground, and flooded the streets. But in doing so, it had revealed a truth buried for generations. The plastic sheet, the strange swelling of the soil, the surge of hidden water, the hidden wooden ceiling beneath his feet. Every piece pointed toward a secret the land had kept long before he'd ever called this place home. The hatch lay before him now, waiting. Beneath it, he sensed the weight of history, the kind that does not disappear simply because time has passed. As he knelt there, surrounded by mud and the remnants of last night's storm, Marcus felt something shift within him. Curiosity, yes, but also responsibility. Whatever was down there had been hidden deliberately. And now, through some unlikely chain of events, it had chosen him to uncover it. The earth no longer whispered. It waited. And Marcus, breathing in the scent of old wood and damp soil, began to prepare himself for what he knew must come next. The hatch lay before Marcus like a doorway into another world, its darkened boards slick with moisture and its iron handle corroded by time. The air that drifted upward from beneath the plastic sheet carried a stale heaviness that unsettled him far more than the storm ever had. It was the scent of a place long cut off from the world above, a space where time had collected and thickened, holding on to years that no one had lived to witness. Kneeling over the buried structure, Marcus could feel that he stood on the threshold of a secret that had waited far too long to be found. The morning light was still dim, filtered through heavy clouds left behind by the storm. The breeze that shuffled across the yard carried the faint smell of wet earth and broken branches, but beneath those ordinary after-storm scents lingered that strange, sour odor rising from below. Marcus adjusted his footing in the soft mud and ran his fingers along the perimeter of the hatch. The wooden frame surrounding it had swollen from years of water resting above it, making the panel fit tightly into place like a cork. Despite the stubbornness of the hatch, he felt an urgency growing inside him. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. Something about the structure beneath his yard caused a pressure in his chest, a sense that the past was calling to him, urging him to expose what had been shut away. The storm had not simply weakened the soil, it had peeled back a layer of time. Marcus tightened his grip on the handle and pulled again. It groaned under the strain, the wood flexing slightly but refusing to break free. His boots sank deeper into the mud as he shifted his weight, pulling harder. Bits of dirt tumbled from the edges of the hatch, falling into whatever space lay below. The mud dragged at him and the handle bit into his palms, but still the hatch would not budge. He sat back on the ground, breathing hard. The cold air filled his lungs, clearing his mind just enough to think. This wasn't going to open easily. Decades of pressure, water, soil, and rot had fused the wood into its frame. He needed to dig more, clear the edges, expose every part of the hatch so that the wood could move freely. With renewed determination, he rose and went to retrieve his shovel from the shed. When he returned, he began to scoop the wet soil away from the perimeter of the wooden ceiling. Each shovelful was heavy, thick with water, and clung stubbornly to the metal. He worked steadily, carving out a wider space around the hatch, paying careful attention not to let the shovel strike or damage the aged wood unnecessarily. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the depression widened, and the outline of the hidden structure became clearer. What he originally thought was a simple hatch now revealed itself to be part of a larger, carefully crafted construction. The wooden ceiling was perfectly flat and uniform, built with boards set in a deliberate pattern. The edges were reinforced with beams that hinted at walls below. The craftsmanship was unmistakably purposeful. This had not been thrown together quickly or carelessly. Whoever had built this had done so with precision and intent. The smell that drifted upward grew sharper as he exposed more of the structure. It carried the unmistakable scent of old wood, damp stone, and something else. Something that reminded Marcus of fruit left too long in a cellar. It was the smell of fermentation, faint but persistent. The storm had awakened a sleeping chamber, one that held on to traces of what it once stored. Marcus set the shovel aside when he had cleared enough of the surrounding soil. He crouched again and inspected the newly exposed beams. The hatch now had room to lift if he could muster the strength. He reached out and gripped the metal ring again. His hands were coated in mud, and the iron felt slick, but he wrapped his fingers tightly around it and pulled. This time, the hatch shifted slightly. It was only a small movement, a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to fill Marcus with a burst of adrenaline. He pulled again, harder, gritting his teeth as the wood creaked, then cracked. The sound echoed faintly in the hollow beneath the hatch, confirming his suspicion. There was space down there. A room, a chamber. The hatch gave way suddenly, lifting upward with a loud, splintering sound. Marcus stumbled back as cold, stagnant air rushed from the opening. He steadied himself and leaned forward to look inside. The light from the overcast sky poured into the cavity, illuminating the outlines of a small chamber below. Wooden steps descended into darkness, though most had rotted away into jagged shards barely clinging to the wall. Marcus reached for his flashlight, which he kept clipped to his belt. He switched it on and aimed the beam downward. The light cut into the shadows, revealing the room's interior. The walls were lined with wooden shelves that sagged under the weight of time. Dust clung to every surface, thick and undisturbed. Cobwebs stretched across the corners like ancient curtains. But it was what rested on the shelves that made Marcus's breath catch. Bottles. Hundreds of them. They sat in neat rows, though some had toppled over, rolling to the floor long ago. The glass was coated in a layer of grime so thick that it hid whatever lay inside. Some bottles were tall and slender, others short and stout, but all of them bore labels faded with age, the ink barely legible. Marcus lowered himself to his stomach and carefully slid the upper half of his body through the opening, gripping the edge of the hatch to keep his balance. He shone the flashlight across the floor. The room was not large, perhaps 10 feet by 12, but it had clearly been designed with care. This was no root cellar or makeshift storage. This was a wine cellar, a carefully built one, hidden deliberately from the world above. His heart hammered as he scanned the shelves. The bottles didn't look like the cheap kind you'd find in a grocery store. Their shapes, their craftsmanship, even the faint lines of their labels hinted at age. real age. He reached down and grabbed one that lay near the bottom of the stairs, its glass cool and slick with condensation that had formed as fresh air entered the chamber for the first time in decades. When he wiped away a section of grime, his breath caught. The date, printed faintly on the label, was from the early 1900s. Marcus stared at it, stunned. He traced the faded ink with his thumb, barely able to believe what he saw. This was old, far older than he had expected. The cellar beneath his yard was a relic from another era, from a time before his house had even been built. Someone had collected these bottles, stored them carefully, and then gone to incredible lengths to hide the entire cellar beneath layers of soil and plastic. But why? And who? He withdrew from the hatch and stood again, staring down into the chamber. The smell of fermentation was stronger now, but so was the realization that he had found something extraordinary. Hidden beneath his quiet, unassuming yard was a secret preserved by time and circumstance. A forgotten cellar filled with wines that might have been worth fortunes even when they were first bottled. The storm had not merely exposed a flaw in his lawn, it had uncovered a bridge to the past. Marcus gripped the edge of the hatch, steadying himself. His mind raced with possibilities, some thrilling, others unsettling. There were answers buried down there along with those bottles. Answers that could reshape everything he thought he knew about this property, about its past owners, and perhaps even about the quiet history of the town itself. He felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders once more. Whatever he had found was no small matter, and he knew he couldn't keep it to himself. Not when the implications were this significant. But for now, he simply stood at the edge of the hatch, looking into the shadowy chamber below, his flashlight beam dancing across the dust-laden shelves. The cellar was no longer silent. It breathed again, awakened after decades of darkness, and its story, long hidden beneath layers of soil, had only just begun to surface. Marcus rose slowly, unable to break his gaze from the opening in the earth. He felt the gravity of the moment, a strange pull that tightened around him. The storm had brought destruction to many homes in the neighborhood, but it had gifted him something else entirely, a glimpse into a forgotten world concealed beneath his feet. And now, with the hatch finally open and the cellar exposed to the light, Marcus understood that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. For several minutes after opening the hatch, Marcus simply stood there, staring into the cellar as though afraid that if he blinked, the strange and fragile connection between past and present might seal itself again. The cold air rising from the chamber carried the weight of years. Decades of silence pressed into every damp board and dusty bottle. The storm had torn the earth open, and now the forgotten room beneath the yard stood exposed, raw, and vulnerable. Marcus felt a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. His discovery was extraordinary, yes, but it also demanded answers that he was not prepared to find on his own. The morning deepened as the sun struggled to break through the thick cloud cover. Eventually, Marcus forced himself to step away from the hatch, wiping mud from his hands as he considered his next move. The cellar was too large, too old, and too carefully constructed to be something trivial. There were legal implications, historical consequences, safety concerns, and, most daunting of all, a deep sense that whatever lay beneath his yard was not just a forgotten storage room, but part of a larger story. He couldn't keep it to himself any longer. After a brief hesitation, he returned to the house, cleaned himself enough not to track mud across the floor, and reached for his phone. His hands were trembling slightly as he dialed the town's building department. He didn't know precisely what he should say, only that he needed help, professional help, to understand the scope of what he had uncovered. When the operator transferred him to an inspector on duty, Marcus struggled to explain the situation without sounding unhinged. He described the strange swelling of the yard after the storm, the surge of trapped water, and finally, the revelation of the old structure beneath the plastic sheet. The inspector, sounding more puzzled than anything else, agreed to send someone out. Within an hour, a white truck pulled up near the curb, its tires splashing through puddles left behind by the night's storm. A middle-aged man stepped out, wearing a reflective vest and carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself as Tom Hargrave, a senior inspector for the county. His expression was skeptical at first, but after Marcus led him into the backyard and revealed the open hatch, his demeanor shifted dramatically. Tom knelt beside the opening, shining his own flashlight into the space below. He inhaled sharply, the air pulling at his throat. The smell of old fermentation and stale wood was potent, and the sight of dozens upon dozens of ancient bottles resting on sagging shelves left him speechless for several seconds. Then he straightened, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I've seen old wells, forgotten storm shelters, even Prohibition-era hideouts buried under yards," he muttered, half to himself, "but never anything like this." He radioed his department immediately, his tone clipped and urgent. Within the hour, 2 more vehicles arrived, one carrying an engineer and a historical consultant, another with 2 members of the town's preservation society. Each new arrival was greeted by the same stunned silence as they peered into the cellar. The news of the discovery spread quickly through the small town's administrative channels, and by midday, 3 additional specialists were on site, including a wine historian from a local university, who had rushed over upon hearing the words "sealed cellar" and early 1900s bottles. The yard, once a private and quiet place, now buzzed with activity. Marcus watched from a few feet away as the experts took photographs, tested the structural integrity of the wooden ceiling, and documented every detail of the cellar's contents. Cables and harnesses were set up before anyone risked climbing inside. The cellar was old, and the wooden beams supporting the ceiling had sagged under the weight of time and soil. Safety was paramount, though everyone present seemed far more fascinated than afraid. The wine historian, a wiry man in his 50s named Dr. Lawrence Miller, was the first to lower himself into the cellar using the safety harness. As he descended, he spoke softly, as though entering a sacred space. His flashlight beam swept across the shelves, pausing frequently as he reached out to gently touch each bottle. When he finally climbed back up, his eyes were bright with disbelief and excitement. "These bottles, they're real," he said breathlessly, turning to face Marcus. "Some of these labels, look here. This winery closed during the Prohibition era and never reopened. This bottle on the lower shelf, it's a 1913 Riesling from a vineyard that collapsed in a flood nearly a century ago. I've only seen references to it in old auction records, and this one, this Bordeaux, this was imported illegally in the 1920s. It might be worth thousands even in its current state." He paused, swallowing hard. If the entire collection is intact, we could be looking at a historical treasure, possibly one of the most complete pre-Prohibition cellars ever found in this region. One of the engineers stepped forward, flashlight in hand. "What puzzles me," he said, "is how well preserved some of these bottles seem to be. The temperature down there is consistent. The humidity is high but steady. It's almost like a natural climate-controlled environment. Whoever built this cellar knew what they were doing. Marcus absorbed their words in stunned silence. Everything they said felt surreal, like a dream he hadn't fully woken from. His backyard, a simple patch of earth behind a modest house, held something of immense historical and financial value. Something people had been searching for, studying, or only ever reading about in old archives. The cellar wasn't just a relic, it was a miracle of preservation. At one point, the Preservation Society representative, a woman named Evelyn, approached Marcus with a clipboard. Her face was lit by a combination of professional composure and barely restrained excitement. "Mr. Harris," she said, "we need to document some information about your property. When did you purchase the home?" "About 10 years ago," Marcus replied. "And before that, do you know how long the previous owners lived here?" "I think the Kellers owned it for nearly 40 years, he said. "It was in their family for generations before they sold it. I remember the realtor telling me it was one of the oldest homes on this street." Evelyn scribbled notes. "That aligns with what we're starting to suspect. This cellar likely predates the house itself. The construction style suggests it could have been built in the early 1900s, or even slightly earlier." Another expert, an archivist who had been quietly reviewing records on her tablet, joined the conversation. "I did a quick search on the property history," she said. "The land was originally owned by a German immigrant family in the 1910s. The patriarch was rumored to have been an avid wine collector. There were even vague stories in old newspapers about a hidden cellar that disappeared after one of the Prohibition raids. But no one ever found it, and over the years the story drifted into local lore." Marcus blinked. "So you're telling me this cellar belonged to him?" "It's highly likely," the archivist replied. "And if so, these bottles are nearly priceless in terms of historical value." As experts continued their careful examination, Marcus watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had expected perhaps a damaged pipe, or maybe an abandoned storm bunker beneath his yard. Not this. Not a lost cellar, sealed away beneath layers of earth and protected by an industrial-grade plastic sheet. Who had placed that plastic? Why had it been hidden so thoroughly? And how had no one known about it? Even the Kellers, who had lived here longer than Marcus had been alive. These questions simmered in the background as the professionals continued their work. At one point, Dr. Miller approached Marcus again, holding a bottle wrapped carefully in a clean cloth. The label was barely visible through the grime, but enough remained to identify the vineyard and year. "This bottle alone," the historian said softly, "could fetch $5,000 or more at an auction if it's still intact. Some of the rarer specimens down there, if we catalog everything correctly, could be worth considerably more. Tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds if the right collector is found." Marcus felt the ground tilt beneath him, though it had nothing to do with the weakened soil. He stared at the bottle, his thoughts spinning. He had never owned anything worth even a fraction of that amount. He had worked his entire life, always careful, always modest, never expecting more than what he earned through sweat and persistence. And now, by sheer accident, a storm had unearthed something that could transform his life completely. As the afternoon wore on, the yard became a small hub of activity. More equipment arrived. More specialists asked questions. More cameras clicked and flashed. Marcus found himself repeating the same story again and again. The storm, the swelling ground, the strange hissing, the burst of water, and finally the discovery of the plastic sheet. Each time he recounted it, the reactions were the same: disbelief, wonder, fascination. But alongside the excitement, Marcus noticed something else, an undercurrent of respect. The experts treated the cellar like a sacred find, a preserved capsule of history that had somehow survived untouched beneath their feet. And they treated him, the man who had uncovered it, not as someone lucky, but as someone entrusted with a responsibility, the guardian of a forgotten chapter of the town's past. By dusk, as the shadows lengthened across the yard and the experts began packing their equipment, Tom Hargrave approached Marcus one last time. His expression was solemn, but not unfriendly. "You've got something remarkable here, Marcus," he said. "This isn't just an interesting discovery. It's a historic one. Our department is going to help you navigate the next steps. Legal, structural, everything. You'll need protection over the site, maybe even fencing. But rest assured, this cellar and everything inside it belongs to you." Marcus nodded slowly, the words settling on him like a weight. Not a burden, exactly, but a responsibility he had never asked for, yet felt compelled to honor. When the last vehicle pulled away and the yard grew quiet again, Marcus stood alone beside the open hatch. The cellar lay beneath him, illuminated only by the faint glow of his flashlight. The storm had passed, the experts had gone, but the secret beneath the earth remained, now fully awakened. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air settle into his lungs. The sky above was beginning to clear, streaks of pale lavender cutting through the retreating clouds. As night approached, the truth of what he had discovered wrapped itself around him like the onset of a new season. Unexpected, powerful, and irreversible. This was the day everything changed, and it was only the beginning. When the last of the experts departed and the rumble of their vehicles faded into the quiet of the evening, Marcus remained in his backyard long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The hatch stood open before him, the darkness beneath it no longer intimidating but solemn and strangely inviting. The faint glow of his flashlight reflected off the dusty bottles far below, like weak stars scattered across a forgotten sky. Everything that had taken place during the day felt surreal, as though he had lived it not in the present, but in some fragmented dream that clung to the edges of reality. Yet the cold mud drying on his boots, the lingering scent of the open cellar, and the deep ache in his muscles assured him that this was no dream. This was his life now, vastly different from the one he'd known when he woke that morning. Marcus leaned against the fence as he tried to process the enormity of what had unfolded. Only hours ago, he had been a simple man living a simple life, a mechanic whose days followed a predictable rhythm. He fixed cars, paid bills, tended to his yard, and hoped that the pressure of everyday life would ease eventually. Now, he stood on top of a historical treasure, a sealed cellar that experts believed might contain one of the most valuable pre-Prohibition wine collections in the region. The mere thought felt too large for him to grasp. His heart raced between excitement and fear. Fear not of danger, but of change. Change had always unsettled him, and this discovery promised nothing but change. He finally closed the hatch for the night, securing it with a sturdy tarp the inspectors had left behind and weighting it with sandbags. They had assured him it was temporary, a stopgap measure until protective fencing and equipment arrived. As Marcus walked back to the house, the cool air brushed against the back of his neck, carrying with it the scent of wet soil and old wood from the cellar. He paused halfway up the steps and looked back at the yard one last time. A quiet shiver of anticipation slid down his spine, and he realized that despite his fears, a part of him felt a renewed sense of purpose, as though the ground itself had entrusted him with a legacy he could not ignore. Sleep did not come easily. Marcus lay awake for hours, his mind replaying the events of the day, fearing he might overlook something important. He thought about Tom Hargrave's steady voice, assuring him that the cellar and everything inside it belonged to him. He thought about Evelyn from the Preservation Society jotting down information as though recording the first lines of a future museum exhibit. But he thought most about Dr. Lawrence Miller, the wine historian whose trembling hands had cradled a bottle worth more than Marcus had ever imagined. The look in the historian's eyes had not been the greedy hunger Marcus expected. Instead, it was reverent, as though the cellar represented something far greater than money. It represented memory, history, humanity. As dawn crept across the sky, Marcus rose to make coffee, though his hands were still unsteady. He drank slowly, letting the warmth anchor him to the present. For the first time in years, he did not plan to go to work. He called his boss, briefly explained that he had an emergency at home, and hung up before the older man could ask questions. This day required his full attention. By mid-morning, people began arriving. Not the swarm of experts from the day before, but neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers. Word had spread with astonishing speed. Marcus found himself answering questions at the fence line, politely but firmly refusing anyone entry. The cellar had been declared a protected historical site within hours of discovery, and only authorized personnel were permitted near it. Even so, people leaned in eagerly, whispering to one another about the treasure buried beneath his feet. One neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, clasped her hands together as she peered across the yard. "They say your wines are from before the 1920s, she said breathlessly. "Imagine that. Bottles older than all of us combined. Why, the papers are saying you might be sitting on a gold mine." Marcus smiled faintly, though he didn't know how to respond. A gold mine, the phrase echoed in his mind, strange and foreign. He had never been wealthy, never even dreamed of being wealthy. His life had been defined by modest accommodations, modest means, and modest hopes. Even now, the idea of sudden fortune seemed distant, as though it belonged to a story written about someone else. When the official representatives returned, 3 people from the municipality, 2 from the Preservation Society, and Dr. Miller, Marcus felt a sense of relief. Their presence grounded him. They spoke with him privately near the back of the yard, explaining the next steps. The cellar needed structural reinforcement. The wooden ceiling would have to be supported to avoid collapse. They also discussed the legal process required to verify ownership of the contents, though everyone agreed that Marcus, as the homeowner, had full rights to the discovery. These processes would take time, but there was no doubt the cellar belonged to him, as did everything inside. Once the initial logistics were settled, Dr. Miller pulled him aside. His face was earnest, almost glowing with the excitement of a man who had stumbled upon something he had spent a lifetime studying. "Marcus," he said gently, "today is the beginning of something significant. Not just for you, but for the entire region. This cellar, your cellar, is a piece of lost history. The bottles inside may be worth more than we can estimate right now, but their worth isn't only financial. They represent a snapshot of pre-prohibition culture, of winemaking traditions long extinct, of stories we may never fully uncover. You are the steward of that history now." The words settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders, heavier even than the idea of financial gain. He felt humbled, almost overwhelmed, but also profoundly honored. The responsibility was enormous, yet something inside him, something quiet but resilient, accepted it. As the day progressed, Marcus worked alongside the experts as they carefully extracted several bottles for further study. Each bottle was photographed, cataloged, and placed in protective cases. Marcus watched the process with a sense of reverence, marveling at the delicacy with which every object was handled. These bottles had survived wars, the Great Depression, the tearing down of old neighborhoods, and decades of burial beneath his own backyard. They were survivors, just like him. In the afternoon, as the crowd thinned and the professionals continued their careful work, Marcus found himself wandering the edges of the yard, reflecting on the unexpected turn his life had taken. He remembered his struggles, barely making ends meet, working long hours at the garage, patching holes in his roof with whatever he could afford, planning meals carefully to stretch a tight budget. He had never complained. He was used to working hard. But now, for the first time in his life, the possibility of true financial freedom felt within reach. Marcus pictured what he could do with the proceeds from selling even a portion of the cellar's contents. He could pay off his mortgage. He could renovate the aging house. He could finally start the small repair shop he had dreamed of opening someday, a shop with his name on the sign. He could secure his future, something he had never felt confident about before. But alongside the excitement, a deep sense of humility settled in him. He was not a man prone to selfishness. And though he respected the cellar's monetary value, he felt an equally strong obligation to protect its historical significance. He wanted to share it with the world, not hoard it for himself. His role, he realized, was not just to profit from the cellar, but to ensure that its story continued long after he was gone. As evening approached once more, Marcus stood before the open hatch, gazing down into the cellar illuminated by temporary work lights. The old wooden steps were still unstable, but now reinforced by careful rigging. The air below was no longer thick with undisturbed decay. The circulation had improved after a full day of exposure. He could see deeper now, the rows of bottles stretching the length of the chamber, some still standing proudly on the shelves, others resting on the dirt floor where they had rolled long ago. He descended part way this time, stopping just above the last intact step. From here, he could see the entire chamber. The curved shadows of the bottles, the stillness of the air, the dust dancing in the beam of his flashlight. It all felt unreal, like stepping into the preserved ruins of a forgotten era. He crouched and carefully picked up a bottle that lay near the steps. The label was almost completely faded, but the embossed glass bore the mark of a vineyard he recognized from Dr. Miller's earlier explanations. He brushed the surface gently, as though handling something sacred. As he stood there, holding the tangible weight of history in his hands, he felt something shift within him. The last traces of doubt dissolved. The last remnants of fear evaporated. He no longer felt confused or overwhelmed. Instead, he felt anchored, connected to something larger than himself. He climbed out of the cellar and stood in the fading light of the yard, holding the bottle carefully. The world around him seemed different now, more alive, more possible. The storm had torn through the town with violent force, but in its wake it had given him something extraordinary, an opportunity to transform his life, to preserve a piece of history, and to redefine his future. He placed the bottle gently on a protective stand and looked over the yard one last time before heading inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new decisions. But as he closed the door behind him and the night settled over the quiet neighborhood, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in many years: hope. Not the fragile, fleeting hope of someone wishing for a break, but the steady, solid hope of a man who knew his life had just been irrevocably set on a new path. A man standing at the dawn of a future shaped not by luck, but by destiny. If you want more unbelievable stories like this, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Share this video with your friends and check out the rest of our stories. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming.